Depending where you are in the world, good morning or good afternoon. Hi, my name is Marcus Ward. I'm the Division Manager for the Safety Assurance Division and the Operation Directorate of Commercial Space Transportation of the Federal Aviation Administration. Today's workshop is to inform the current commercial space operators on AST's Compliance and Enforcement Program. Believe it or not, AST's Compliance and Enforcement Program was revamped in 2014 and has been working to be more efficient, more effective in how we apply our compliance throughout the industry. Today, we have the current program lead for compliance and enforcement, Mr. Doug Harmon, who will be providing today's briefing. Mr. Harmon joined AST in March of 2016 and is based in our Western Region office, Vandenberg Space Force Base, ASA 330. Mr. Harmon is a valuable asset to our organization as a lead safety inspector. Now, he's often been assigned to very high-risk, high-visibility assignments, including many human spaceflight missions. As a senior lead safety inspector, he has worked diligently and hardly to ensure commercial space transportation safety, and he has a firm understanding of the regulations. Now, I would just add to, we have a Q&A or a chat box below. Please put your questions into that box. And I think that's it. Over to you, Doug.
Thank you, Marcus, and good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are in the world. I'm Doug Harmon, Compliance and Enforcement Lead for AST. And like Marcus had mentioned, if you have any questions, write them down in the Q&A on the bottom of your monitor, and we'll attempt to answer these after the presentation. Next slide. This is the overview of the planned discussion points concerning our compliance and enforcement program. Next slide. And our introduction. Next slide. To start off, I wanted to explain what our Safety Assurance Division in the Office of Commercial Space Transportation, as I'll refer to throughout this presentation as AST, is responsible for. Our safety inspectors monitor pre-operational, operational, and post-operational phases of FAA-regulated commercial space transportation activities, which can impact public safety and the safety of property. Some pre-operational activities include qualifications, installation, and testing of flight safety system components, mission readiness reviews, operational rehearsals, simulations, and/or exercises. Some operational activities include monitoring countdown procedures, identifying non-nominal or public safety issues, and some post-operational activities include documentation and monitoring of post-operational reviews. The FAA is responsible for protecting the public during commercial space transportation launch and re-entry operations. Public safety is at the core of the FAA licensing or permitting process of the safety inspections conducted before, during, and after a launch or re-entry, and the investigation and corrective actions following a mishap or compliance event. The Office of Commercial Space Transportation monitors license compliance with the Commercial Space Launch Act, the Commercial Space Transportation Licensing Regulations, the terms and conditions set forth in the operator license. A licensee shall allow access by and cooperation with federal officers or employees or other individuals authorized by the FAA to observe any activity of the licensee or of the licensee's contractor or subcontractors associated with the conduct of a license activity. The Safety Assurance Division, through inspections, verifies that you are operating in accordance with the representations made contained in your application. Next slide. U.S. Commercial Space Launch Act, dated 1984, was updated in 2004 with the Commercial Space Launch Amendment Act, which provides authority to the Federal Aviation Administration. Under this act, the FAA representatives will attend every launch, re-entry, or flight alongside operators to ensure public safety. The Commercial Space Amendment Act of 2004 is the FAA authority, and the FAA Order 2150.3C outlines our compliance and enforcement program. Next slide. AST is required to regulate this rapidly growing industry to ensure public safety. We also promote the industry by assisting our licensees and permittees through the application process. Having a good working relationship with the operators allows for communication which promotes voluntary disclosure and regulatory assistance to maintain compliance. When regulatory standards are not met, we attempt to use the most effective means to return the operator back into compliance, usually at the lowest level, but can elevate to even a civil penalty. Next slide. All FAA personnel are required to report noncompliances to the appropriate compliance and enforcement office. For AST, we are required by our FAA Order 21.3C to investigate all alleged noncompliances. This responsibility aligns with our vision to be agile world leaders, working to ensure safety while addressing the needs of industry and to be ready for the journey to safely propel commercial space transportation into the next frontier. Next slide. For commercial space operators, you have the statutory obligation to meet regulatory standards. In order to meet these regulations, operators develop processes and procedures to maintain compliance. Next slide. Although outlined in our FAA order, AST currently does not have a voluntary disclosure program, but we are working to develop a program to continue to promote our working relationship with our operators. Currently, AST views operator voluntary disclosure as willing and able, which I'll define in a later slide. AST inspectors will review the alleged noncompliance and take into account the voluntary disclosure when applying an enforcement action. Next slide. Documents and FAA internal processes. Next slide. Here's a list of documents that an operator could receive. The inspection letter is what the Safety Assurance Division sends out after the completion of each mission or inspection. This letter outlines the compliance status of the inspection or mission with the governing regulations if in noncompliance. If in noncompliance, you could receive a warning notice, request for corrective action letter, a letter of correction, or a letter of investigation. The last lines on the slide define the Enforcement Investigation System, or EIS, which is the FAA's electronic filing system for administrative and legal enforcement actions. The Enforcement Investigation Report, or EIR, is the package that all lines of business in the FAA, to include AST, send to our legal counsel for processing. Next slide. FAA enforcement actions. Next slide, please. Outlined in our FAA order are compliance enforcement actions, administrative enforcement actions, and legal enforcement actions. The least severe would be the compliance action, moving up to administrative action, and finally legal action. Administrative actions have two subcategories: repeat noncompliance, or a compliance action is insufficient. Under legal actions, there are three subcategories of required, warranted, and emergency actions. Next slide. The slide I was referring to earlier concerning willing and able. This is how the FAA defines these terms and how the inspectors use the able definition to ensure the operator has resources to correct the noncompliance, and the willing definition to determine the enforcement action needed to bring the operator back into compliance. Next slide. For compliance enforcement actions, this can be a verbal counseling, but is followed up with written correspondence. We attempt to use the inspection letter after each inspection or mission, but sometimes may just use an email to inform the operator of the noncompliance. If additional corrective actions are needed, that will be communicated and AST will work with the operator to get them back into compliance. AST tracks compliance actions internally and not through the FAA EIS system to ensure trends do not develop. Next slide. Administrative enforcement actions are the next level using severity and likelihood in a risk matrix and/or showing a trend for enforcement. There are two subcategories of repeated noncompliance, or a compliance enforcement action is insufficient. The FAA tracks all noncompliances, and if a trend starts, the next step is to increase the severity of the enforcement action to bring the operator back into compliance. Repeated noncompliances may include multiple regulations of the same type during a single inspection, recurring noncompliance of the same type during multiple inspections, or noncompliances of different regulations arising from a common root cause. Compliance action is insufficient. Do you remember the able and willing definition? This can be a contributing factor to elevating an enforcement action. FAA inspectors will always attempt to work with the operator at the lowest possible level of enforcement to bring them back into compliance. Next slide. For legal enforcement actions, there are two paths for the FAA order outlines. The first being a civil penalty, starting with the EIR package completed by AST, which is transferred to our legal counsel, where a sanction is established and then sent to the operator using a notice of proposed civil penalty. Under an emergency action, the license or permit is suspended or revoked due to the immediate threat to public safety. Either path is processed the same way from AST to our legal counsel. There, as you see, AGC. Next slide, please. AST's enforcement action. Next slide, please. AST uses the FAA order to align our own procedure for the compliance and enforcement program. The lowest level enforcement is a compliance action. All enforcement action notifications to the operator start with an inspection letter and at the conclusion of an inspection or mission. In the inspection letter, AST explains the alleged noncompliance, and if any additional documentation is needed. If no other documentation is needed, the operator is informed of the status of the case, and for compliance enforcement action, they are generally closed with the inspection letter. The caveat to this process is if the inspector is notified of an alleged noncompliance after the inspection letter has gone out, then the same information is used to notify the operator using just an email. Next slide, please. The next level of risk to public safety is the administrative enforcement action. Using the inspection letter to the operator, the noncompliance is explained and the status of the noncompliance remains open, and the operator is informed that additional correspondence will follow. The warning notice, request for corrective action letter, or a letter of corrections are the potential follow-up correspondence to the inspection letter and will further detail the noncompliance status. All administrative enforcement actions are entered into the FAA enforcement investigation system for tracking. Next slide, please. Just to review the documents of an administrative enforcement action and what information is being communicated to the operator. For administrative enforcement actions, these will remain open until one of the following: a warning notice, which informs the operator that the FAA has closed the administrative action, but also encourages the operator to stay in compliance. A request for corrective action letter requests from the operator that the FAA requires corrective actions for the alleged noncompliance. A corrective action letter informs the operator that the FAA accepts or denies the operator's corrective actions, and the administrative enforcement action will remain open until corrective actions can be verified. Once additional information is obtained or verified, the operator is informed of the closure of the administrative action. A no action letter is when an alleged noncompliance is investigated and found to be unsubstantiated. The operator is informed that the FAA has closed the enforcement action and found the operator to be in compliance with no further action required. Next slide, please. The effects of a compliance or administrative action to the operator are administrative in nature. The FAA documents these noncompliances for tracking and trending purposes, and again, working with their operator who are willing and able to correct the noncompliance is considered for the appropriate enforcement action. Administrative enforcement actions can be elevated to a legal enforcement action if certain criteria are met. I'll go over these criteria in the next slides. Next slide, please. Here's the first of two slides that list the criteria that need to be met in order to process a legal enforcement action. Under required legal enforcement action, intentional or reckless conduct, failure to complete corrective actions, lack of care, judgment, or responsibility, or unacceptable risk to safety must be processed as a legal enforcement action. Next slide, please. The second type of legal enforcement action is called warranted legal enforcement action. That is either a repeated noncompliance or the operator meets the criteria of lack of technical qualifications. As I mentioned on previous slides, administrative actions can be elevated to legal enforcement actions. And if you notice, the repeated noncompliance shows up in administrative as well as legal actions. Is this a pattern or a trend? AST works with the operators that are willing and able to correct their noncompliance, but if a corrective action does not eliminate the noncompliance and AST starts to see a trend, the potential compliance action could be elevated to administrative, and if not corrected, a potential legal action. Next slide, please. If you're seeing a pattern, you are correct. At the conclusion of an inspection or mission, the operator receives an inspection letter. The inspection letter will outline any alleged noncompliance, and with legal enforcement actions, the noncompliance status will remain open and will be referenced by an enforcement investigation system case number and addressed in a separate correspondence. A letter of investigation is then sent to the operator, again, outlining the noncompliance and requests the operator's side of the story. Next slide, please. The letter of investigation outlines the alleged noncompliance and requests additional information regarding this potential noncompliance, or more specifically, the operator's side of the story. The FAA order states that the operator is not required to respond to the letter of investigation, but by not responding, AST does not get the operator's side of the story. And how do you think it is viewed by the inspector concerning willing and able by not responding? Next slide, please. When an operator responds to the letter of investigation, the root cause, if known, possible corrective actions, and any mitigating circumstances need to be addressed. If the inspector still has outstanding requests for documentation from their initial investigation, those may also need to be added. Next slide, please. But first, how does a legal enforcement get processed through AST? The inspector properly documents, investigates, and gathers evidence to create an enforcement investigation report, or EIR package. It is processed and briefed to our AST management to verify that this case meets the criteria for a legal action. Once approved, the EIR package is transferred to our legal counsel, as you see as AGC 300, for verification and processing. Here's where the case is again evaluated, sanctions applied, and finally notifying the operator of the proposed civil penalty. Additional discussions with legal counsel for both sides are ongoing, and finally, our legal counsel issues an order assessing civil penalty. Next slide, please. The FAA is authorized to assess civil penalties for the violation of the Commercial Space Launch Act, regulations prescribed under the Act, the term of any license issued under the Act for commercial space, and here are the sanctions amounts depending on their severity. The Associate Administrator for Commercial Space Transportation is authorized to review commercial space license and permit suspensions or revocations, denials of applications for launch license or permits, and civil penalty actions. Commercial space civil penalty actions are subject to adjudication by a Department of Transportation administrative law judge and, on appeal, by the Associate Administrator for Commercial Space Transportation, who serves as the FAA decision maker in commercial space civil penalty cases. These cases have a time limit of 5 years from the date of violation for the filing of a complaint before the Department of Transportation. Next slide. In summary, we covered the AST compliance and enforcement program, how it relates to the FAA Order 2150.3C. We covered the 3 compliance, administrative, and legal enforcement actions. went over some terms and types of subcategories of administrative and legal enforcement actions, then went over the process and documentation that an operator would see for each enforcement action and possible documentation replies from the operator to the FAA. Next slide, please. And Sherman, who was looking at our Q&As, do we have any questions from the audience?
Hey, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. My name is Sherman Council, and looking at the Q&A chat, I don't see any specific requests for feedback from you, Doug. However, I do see a request for the charts that someone has asked for following the meeting.
And I think those were put on the chat, if I'm not mistaken, or we can have those put on the chat so people can access them through Google Docs.
Yeah, additionally, they are currently available on the website to the compliance and enforcement mishap page. One other question that just came in, will the recording be provided following the meeting as well?
I'm sorry, was that to me or was it to?
Marcus, I think that might be a question for you. One of the attendees is asking about the recording and if that's going to be provided following the meeting.
Yeah, we can provide an answer. I think Janice is going to respond back in the chat on that one.
Okay.
Over.
One other question I see, are formal legal enforcement actions taken, documented in a system that can be viewed by the public? In other words, once the documentation is formalized in AST, would the attendees or would an applicant have access to that decision that was made by AST?
I'm wondering if that should be answered by our AGC counsel.
Yeah.
Guess that's my cue.
Thanks, Chris.
No problem. They are not documented in a system that can be viewed by the public. If by that you mean something that you can just go onto the website and log on easily enough. The details on a particular action would be, some of those would be subject to FOIA. Also, there is a, I believe, quarterly report that is published, not AST specific, but just of all of the legal enforcement actions, or in particular the civil penalty ones that were taken by the FAA as a whole. Over.
Okay, thank you, Chris. I think I have a general question in the chat that says AOC question mark. I think they're asking what the acronym AOC stands for. Doug or Marcus, did you want to take that one and elaborate on the response?
AOC is the Office of Communication.
I think they were looking for purpose and responsibility for that office.
It's the FAA's Office of Communication, AOC.
Yeah, I don't see any additional questions in the chat at the moment. Does anyone else have any questions for Mr. Harmon or Mr. Ward before we convene today's workshop? Okay, at this point, I'll hand it over to you, Marcus, to perhaps close the workshop.
Yeah, Thanks, Sherman, and thanks, Doug. If you do have any follow-on questions, you can email me directly at Marcus, marcus.ward@faa.gov, and just put enforcement questions in your subject line. If there are no more questions, I think we'll end today's workshop. Thank you.